What is God? When people say, I believe in God, what exactly do they mean? And what does to believe in something actually mean? And when you say I, who exactly is believing? All of this I want to unpack in this video and use this conversation between Jordan Peterson and Tom Bilyeu. It's an extended conversation, but I'm going to use roughly 5 minutes as a canvas for unpacking some of these key ideas on the whiteboard over here. So let's jump across to the conversation and dive right on in.
Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Well,
what is God then?
The antithesis of the spirit of totalitarian pride.
Can I simplify that?
Imagine this. Okay, sure. Imagine this. Imagine that here's a form of hell. Auschwitz guard, enjoying his job. Okay, now, I think it's fair to say that your experience exposing yourself to such things has convinced you that there's such a thing as evil. Okay? Whatever is farthest in the opposite direction, that's God.
All right, so that's already super interesting. Let's jump across the whiteboard. God as the furthest from evil. So, I mean, one place to begin here is, do you believe that there is such a thing as evil or bad? Which is the same question as, do you believe that there is such a thing as progress? So let's backpedal a little bit to lay down some really important ideas here. First things first, this is where we are currently, point A, right? And this is where we want to be, point B. Current state over here, ideal state over here. One question to begin with is, life is what? Finish the sentence. If you were to just create a list, life is blah, 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 blah. What is life? Seems like a weird question. But you can start here and you can say, okay, well, life is, to a degree, a game of limitation, right? Because to be is to be limited, right? If you were omnipresent or I don't know what the other omnis are, but like all powerful, all knowing, and everywhere at the same time, then you're not actually being, so to speak. And so life is, to a degree, limitation. And it's from this limitation that we have suffering. So to be is to be limited, and to be limited is to suffer. I think that's a good starting point, right? And then this is what leads to us having a current state, which is forever inadequate, and then an ideal state, which is a state in which we have, to some degree, transcended an element of our suffering. And all of this is baked into the word progress. To progress is to overcome some kind of limitation or the suffering born of limitation that is baked into this game of being. And we as a species, as Homo sapien, we are uniquely positioned to be eyes wide awake to this game, eyes wide awake to our suffering, eyes wide awake to the fact that we are limited forever and always. You know, this is a forever game. This is a forever state. You know, it's not like we eventually reach point B and we're all good. We are perpetually in this state of affairs trying to bridge the gap. And so if you believe in progress, you also believe in its opposite. You believe in not moving towards the ideal and moving further away from the ideal. I think this is also where perhaps this is a good time to introduce the idea of belief. Okay, what does it mean to believe in something? And when I say I believe in so-and-so, is the words that I speak sufficient? If I just mouth a set of sounds, does that mean I believe something? So if I say, I believe I'm valuable, but then I treat myself like trash, what exactly do I believe? Is it the the acoustics, the vibrations that are coming from my mouth and reaching your ears? Or is it more so my actions? And I think this is where it's also worth asking, when we say I, what is that referring to? So, there may be, we are each a set of almost, each of us has sub-personalities. You can almost think about sub-personalities as being lens through which to view the world. And each mini sub-personality within you has a desired state. So you can almost conceptualize things like hunger, things like sex drive, some of your instincts as the more fundamental sub-personalities that make up you and I. And the I is the unique integration of all of your sub-personalities and my sub-personalities. So the idea that we are each a well-functioning unity. I think as we develop into adults, we all realize this isn't the case. Otherwise, you would just do everything that you wanted to. But the fact is that there are parts of you that pull you in different directions. And so when we say I, it's almost a combination of all of these little sub-personalities being united under the umbrella that which Freud would have actually called the ego. It's like the ego is trying to integrate all of the ids, right? All of the baser instincts. And it's trying to integrate all of them based on this, with the influence of the superego, which is almost like your conscience or your the internal instantiation of the voice of culture that says thou shalt and thou shalt not. So let's backpedal a little bit. I wanted to get clear on belief. So you don't just, when you say I believe in something, it's not just a mouthing of words, it's an acting out. So you can believe in things without saying that you believe in them. You can believe things in your body through action without sound, yeah? What's more, when you say the I believe, it's not as simple as your little consciousness saying, this is what I believe. Because there are plenty of things, if this is like, I've seen it drawn before where, let's say that's an iceberg. Art was never my forte, but let's say that's the iceberg. This is your consciousness or your ego, what's above the surface. But you, in your entirety, is like your conscious and then also your unconscious mind. And so, these are all the all of your little sub-personalities that are operating in the background that you aren't aware of. That it reminds me of the Jungian. What is it? He who doesn't integrate his shadow, it'll play itself out as fate in your life. These little sub-personalities, your unconscious is pulling you in a variety of different directions. You believe things that your little light of consciousness doesn't yet or isn't yet capable of articulating. So when we have mapped all of that out, I suppose we can now then come back to, what is life? So limitation, suffering, and then a game of overcoming. I think this is the fundamental game that all of us are playing. It's, you can end the game at any point, and that is to take your own life. That is to, and what's worse, you can also end the game for other people. If you think being itself is so corrupt that it ought to be ended altogether, you might detonate, an atomic bomb, or if there were a button that would just end being altogether. If you believe that the limitation and suffering is so bad or so unworthy of existence, You might choose to end the game of being altogether. But we all act as though we believe that the game of being, at least those who don't take their own lives, I'm not going to say the word just in case YouTube has an issue with it, but all of us, in choosing to be, in choosing to try and exist, we are choosing this game of overcoming. We're choosing the game, we're choosing limitation, we're choosing the suffering that's baked into the limitation and the game of being, and we're choosing the game of overcoming, because we are each, whether we realize it or not, we have a presupposed current state, like I mentioned before, and we have an ideal state to which we're moving. Now, you might not know what your ideal is, but you certainly act as though there is an ideal. Otherwise, you would just be catatonic. You would just be not moving at all. And so I think this is where also you can believe in things, or you can have values that you aren't aware of. You can move towards certain things and away from other things without realizing. And in that way, these values are kind of baked into your being without your conscious recognition, right? These are your values, your unconscious values, that which is driving your life and your decisions and your actions and your movement through the world without your little consciousness being able to articulate it. So I think that's a starting place for what is life. Can things be better? We all act as though things can be better. We all act as though progress, the notion of progress, is real. We might have different conceptions as to what that looks like. We'll touch on that in a moment. We'll come to human rights later on. And so we've kind of touched as well on defining belief. To believe in something, it's not just a set of sounds that you make with your mouth. It's to act out in a very real way. Now, you can believe more than one thing at once, in the sense that you can have two different parts of you acting out this belief and acting out this belief. And that's where I think it's like the ultimate I, the ultimate individual, doesn't have this. The ultimate individual is integrated. The ultimate individual has taken all of those little sub-personalities and unified them into an I that can actually say, I believe so-and-so, and act that out without contradiction. So all of that, I think, is some groundwork to then say, if we believe in progress, if we believe, and maybe that's also necessary to define, because I suppose that the clip that we were just looking at, right, was JP saying that God, you can think about God as the opposite of, right? God as the opposite of evil. So if we have point A, point B, and let's say point B is this never-ending state. We're never going to reach point B, but this is the overcoming of limitation and suffering. And let's say that its opposite, let me make this a little bit bigger real quick. Let's say that it's opposite. Let's just go to another point B, right? So this is the ideal, and this is like metaphorical heaven up here. And this is metaphorical hell. And maybe let's get some colors in here. Heaven and hell. Give me some red. Yeah, cool. And let's say this is the perpetual amplification of suffering. And what's more, we could make it unnecessary suffering. Right? Suffering to no end, for no purpose. Okay, so let's say that this is our current state. Can we find common ground that, not only can we find common ground that the perpetual amplification of someone's unnecessary suffering. Like if you just had a knob that you could turn that would make someone suffer or feel pain for no reason, as an example, it's like a torture knob. Can we agree that that turning up that torture knob is a bad thing? Can we agree that that's immoral? Can we find common ground on that? What's more, can we find common ground that enjoying turning up that knob, enjoying perpetually amplifying the suffering, the unnecessary suffering of a being, of a conscious being, is bad or evil? And if we can find common ground on that, then we've established the basis for, okay, there's such a thing as a metaphorical hell, and there's such a thing as a metaphorical heaven. It's to presuppose, it's to say that there is an up and a down, a good and a bad. So, what JP is saying here is that one of the easiest ways to get to a belief in God, or to realize or consciously realize that you believe in God, might be to appreciate that you believe in evil. You believe that there is a spirit or a transpersonal subpersonality, right? Which is to say, if there's me, there's you, there is and let's say, this is tough to draw, but let's say, let's say this is my personality, right? I've got hunger, I've got a drive to sleep, I've got a drive or an instinct to seek out water, and you've got the same thing, whatever. And then you can work your way up to more and more complex drives or instincts, and you end up at more and more complex subpersonalities. But a transpersonal subpersonality, you can almost think about drives as transpersonal in the sense that I have a drive for hunger, as do you. I have a drive for sleep, just as you do. So it's almost like these are mini personalities that are transpersonal across different people. Now, we could say that there is a transpersonal subpersonality, or a spirit, might be another word that you would use to describe that, a pattern or a mode of being that exists in you, that exists in me, that exists in other people. It might also be a lens of interpretation through which to move in the world, that we could call evil. It's the spirit of Satan. It's the spirit of the devil. It's the spirit, the pattern of being that can be played out or can possess, might be another way of thinking about it, me or you or somebody else, whatever, or even a group of people. And when it does, when you are possessed or I am possessed by that spirit, or we act out that spirit or that pattern of being, we take everything closer to hell. And I think that is what JP has essentially is trying to put his finger on here, is that if we can agree, like the spirit of the devil or Satan or whatnot, to say you believe in Satan, to say you believe in the devil, or you believe in evil, is that you believe that there is a spirit that enjoys this perpetual amplification of unnecessary suffering and enjoys it, right? And that's what he means by imagine, like this is a reality that has occurred in the past century, right? The Auschwitz guard enjoying the suffering that he's inflicting upon other beings. I read a fantastic book. It was a JP recommendation called, I won't say the actual word. It was looked a bit like this. Let me jump across the iPad. The So-and-so of Nanking. And as a means of familiarizing myself with human beings, if put under the right conditions, human beings' capacity for evil. And I think this is where perhaps a growing into adulthood is an appreciation that there aren't merely good people and bad people, and you're one of the good people. It's more so that put under the right conditions, and I don't want to excuse here, right? I don't want to excuse evil and atrocities, but we can become possessed by bad ideas. We can become possessed by evil. So let's jump back to the video, because I think that hopefully lays out some context here.
What is that? Opposite direction.
I'm going to go back
That's
just a little
God.
bit.
Okay. Whatever is say that. Okay. Now, I think it's fair to say that your experience exposing yourself to such things has convinced you that there's such a thing as evil.
Exposing himself to such things, he was talking about Auschwitz and some of the atrocities that human beings have committed in the past century.
Okay. Whatever is farthest in the opposite direction, that's God. What is that? Well, that's not a simple thing to say. I mean, God is ineffable. God is the ineffable spirit that unites all. That's a good way of thinking about it. So what does that mean? Well, it means an endless number of things, right? Many of which can't be formulated in words, much of which is directly experienced and embodied, imagined, felt, motivated, all of that, not just words. It's certainly not something that can be encapsulated in a set of declarative statements, which is partly what the West is confused about. We think that belief in God is adherence to a statable description of God or a creed. That's not what it is. That's a very small fragment of what it is. Just as our verbal knowledge is a small fragment of our totality.
Can I give you what I think you're saying in my language and tell me if I'm getting correct? Okay, everyone's going to be familiar with the idea of the madness of crowds. And there is something terrifying. If you've ever been around a group that goes from a normal group and they snap over into fighting or whatever, you feel...
Short-term mob.
Yeah, you feel a spirit overcome them where they are linked, and it changes something in the way that they are processing the inputs from their environment.
Definitely. It changes their perceptual frame. Yes.
Perfect.
It changes their emotions. It changes what they see. It changes what they're aiming at, even unconsciously.
That's what I mean by transpersonal subpersonality. It's a mode of being, a lens of interpretation, a subpersonality that a group like this can simultaneously live out. And that's where you can see a mob or a group become possessed by a spirit or an idea.
No different than in some ways, it's no different than the spirit that unites a crowd when it leaps to its feet spontaneously after a particularly brilliant goal. Right? That's also a form of possession, although much more positive form of possession, because that's a celebration of the ability to hit the mark, which is the opposite of sin. Right? Sin means to miss the mark. There's 3 separate derivations of the word sin that come from archery. Yeah. So that's what people are doing in a stadium, is they're allowing themselves to be possessed by the spirit that hits the target brilliantly. Right? All together, collectively. It's a form of worship.
What's interesting in that, so let's put 2 pins in things. So one, the hell is the exact opposite. It's when the crowd goes mad, it breaks bad, it kills, it smashes, it breaks. And then God is the exact opposite of that. It's expansive, joyful, uplifting,
and unifying,
thriving.
And unifying, right?
Both can be unifying,
it has that, yes. It's the proper unity. That's another way. These are definitions, right? They're not statements. They're not descriptive statements about God. They're definitions.
That part hit me like a ton of bricks, and I'm going to see whether I can just kind of explain it on the whiteboard here. So God, he said God is a matter of definitions. So that's where I kind of think, again, about, current state, we can go up, we can go down. This is hell down here, and this is the spirit of evil that enjoys taking us closer to hell. God if this is heaven, this is the ideal state of affairs, and it's like, what exactly is that? That's hard to define. But God is the Spirit, the good. God is the Spirit that takes us in that direction toward the ideal. Now, it's like we've meditated for eons. We're trying to figure out what exactly is God. What exactly is that Spirit? What exactly is that pattern of being, that mode of being, that lens of interpretation, the pattern of behavior that gets us closer to heaven and further away from hell? And again, this is where I think it's much easier to define hell. Maybe, I don't know whether this helps, but it's much easier to, like, if you were to ask yourself, what do you not want to happen? Like, what's like the worst? What's some really bad stuff that could happen? How bad could your life get in a year's time? What would you absolutely not want to go toward? And you could say, like, everyone in your family gets cancer, right? And then it's not even a type of cancer that comes quickly and takes you. It's a long, slow, drawn out, etc. Right? So you can quickly gauge. It's very easy to say that is hell. That we do not want that, right? And anyone who would enjoy that state or bringing about that state, bad, evil. But then, okay, what do you want? Right? Like, what's the way that everything could go well for your life? It's kind of harder to get clear on exactly. It's almost like all of our definitions of hell, it's much easier to find common ground on that. It's much harder to find common ground on what is the ideal that we ought to all aim toward together. Now, I think this is where, I've seen some talks between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and I think they actually find a lot more common ground than we might initially think, because Sam's book, The Moral Landscape, is essentially saying, okay, well, there are peaks and valleys, I should say. And these peaks are like different instantiations of hell. And these peaks are different instantiations or potential instantiations of heaven. So again, it presupposes that there is something down here, hell, and the spirit that enjoys that, bringing about that downward trajectory, the amplification of unnecessary suffering and enjoying it, versus the spirit that is trying to move things up, that is trying to help as many conscious beings as possible overcome this the perpetual state of suffering. And maybe we can identify certain points of suffering that we, through unity, through finding common ground, can overcome together. And that is the notion of progress or of heaven. And God being the spirit that when we live out, we get closer to heaven. So let's jump back to the video.
Definitions. That's a very, very different thing. So imagine that there is a spirit.
And so again, it's like, well, what is God exactly? It's hard to say, but maybe you could say that God, let's define God as the spirit that takes us closer to heaven. If you can't use the word heaven there, or it doesn't relate with you, or like, the person you're speaking with, it doesn't make sense to them, what you can say is God as the spirit or the pattern of being or the lens of interpretation of what should and should not be, that helps us collectively overcome the perpetual state of limitation and suffering. The opposite, right? And again, it's so much easier to just find common ground, is the perpetual amplification of unnecessary suffering and enjoying that bad. If yes, God is the opposite, then okay, let's get some specifics. What exactly is God? Harder to define.
Spirit that properly unifies. That's the monotheistic God. That's the God of Abraham. What is that? Well, who can say? No one can say. We can tell stories about it, and of course the biblical stories are stories about that. That's exactly what they are. But the fastest way in for modern people, I would say, is the route you took. If you don't believe in good, well, try investigating evil and see what you make of that. and then start to understand what that means for you and see what that does to you. Is one of the things I realized, because I started studying malevolence a very long time ago. Now it's 50 years for me. It's a long time. And I certainly became convinced that in some ways there was nothing more real than malevolence. Now, there are arguable contenders. Pain, for example, is a contender. But if malevolence is an undeniable reality, and there's a price to be paid for denying that, by the way, because you turn the Nazi catastrophe into just a matter of opinion, right? If you don't believe in something like the ultimate reality of evil, it's just, well, you know, the Nazis went about things a slightly different way. Who's to say what's right or wrong? And well, the opposite of that, there's an opposite of that, right? It's wherever you go. If you travel as far away from enjoying Auschwitz as you can possibly go. And people might say, well, no one enjoyed Auschwitz. It's like, really? What was the sign over Auschwitz? The joke. Work will make you free. People joked. You tell me they didn't enjoy it. It's like, if you think that people didn't enjoy Auschwitz, you know nothing about human beings and nothing about yourself. If you think you couldn't have enjoyed it, you know nothing about yourself. And that's terrifying and should be. And that it can lead you. You see, that leads you because it gives you something solid to stand on. Something terrible and solid, but nonetheless, something motivating. Because maybe you decide that you don't want to go to hell, so to speak. And maybe you don't want to bring everyone you love along with you. Maybe you don't even want to bring everyone you hate along with you. That's a good realization. Better to redeem than to damn.
Okay, so I think that's a good place to jump back to the whiteboard. So I've just written here. It's like when I was younger, I was much more of I am a maths and science type of person. I like reason, I like analytics, or I like looking at things through an analytical lens. And so I kind of had this caricature of God in my mind. God just being like this all-powerful thing that people pray to, and they use it as cope to, you know, they just can't handle the fact that they can't handle the responsibility for their decisions. They can't handle their mortality. And so they make up this convenient story of this dude in the sky who's going to take care of them. That was my conception of God. And that's why initially, when I was much younger, I was taken to church by my parents. And eventually, you know, when I started to think about it myself, I was like, I do not believe in this. I think all of these people, or a lot of these people, are just following sheepishly and going to a place or choosing a belief that they don't have good grounds to believe on, that is really just convenient and meeting their psychological needs in the face of responsibility for making something of themselves, of taking responsibility for their decisions, and then also looking and embracing the fact that they will die and maybe there isn't an afterlife, right? So, but then I came round full circle to exactly what Bilyeu was just describing there, that a pathway to maybe realizing that you believe in God, it's having to let go of this caricature of a big dude in the sky with the beard who's going to take care of you, and instead going, okay, can we agree upon evil, which presupposes that there is a hell? If we can, then we've agreed that there is such a thing as an ideal or progress. And this is where it really ticks me off when people say they take each to their own too far. Yes, we want liberty. Yes, we want people to have the capacity to make their own decisions. But we mustn't use that as a means of saying any and all ways of being are equally good and valid, which is what JP was trying to say there. You know, if you take, okay, so postmodernism, I whipped out the postmodernism, the PM. Postmodernism, it can become this skepticism or cynicism that says there is no objective truth, no such thing, right? All truth is subjective, and all interpretations of reality, all ways of being are equally good. Equal. And we this is like key word of our generation. Equal, equality, equity, diversity. It's a rejection of ideal. It's to say there is no such thing as an ideal. There are just different ideals. But this is where I think if you drill down deep enough, with everyone, you can find common ground on there is such a thing as metaphorical hell. And there is such a thing as the spirit of evil that enjoys taking us closer to that hell. Now, if we can find common ground on that, then Auschwitz, right, and the Auschwitz guard that enjoys his job, you can't just say, oh, well, that's just another subjective interpretation that's equally valid, right? His mode of being, his lens of interpretation, is just as equally valid as yours or mine. And this is where I wrote a note before. Part of the learnings of the 20th century was, in the Nuremberg trials, not that I'm super familiar with them, but the establishment of universal human rights. To me, there's no difference between that and an admission that there is a shared ideal and a shared notion of what is evil, right? And what is hell. And there are some sins, right? It's like a shared definition of what sin is. Doesn't matter what culture you come from, that what happened in the war in Auschwitz was a sin. It wasn't just an equally valid interpretation of how to be in the world. And I think it's almost like the postmodernism that has then given rise to this modern equality and diversity messaging taken to its extreme. It is the same thing as saying there is no such thing as heaven and hell. There is no such thing as God or evil. There is just different ways of being. And so we need to be careful to, and this is another Jordan Peterson-ism. You can't have the rights without the responsibility. You can't have, you can't be going for the whole liberty thing. Liberty without duty, liberty or rights, the God-given, so to speak, the spark of divinity that makes you worthy of liberty, which I think is also a very Christian or Judeo-Christian idea. You can't have the rights without the responsibility. And it's almost like the same thing to say, you can't, if we just have this liberty without this sense of duty toward service of an ideal, then you leave the door open for evil. And I think also it's like the most dangerous person is the one who thinks that they are not capable of evil. It's the one with the blind spot that you should be most afraid of. And that's where JP was saying to Bilyeu, or Bilyeu was saying that he was trying to go through history with the lens, or learn about history through the lens of, I could have been the Auschwitz guard. And that, again, when I mentioned that book before that I spoke of, this one, The So-and-So of Nanking, I read it trying to envisage myself as one of the committers of atrocity and see whether there was a part of me that could enjoy it. Because one, that's terrifying. But two, you start to realize that evil isn't localized in that person or that person, and you're not the pure embodiment of the good, incapable of evil. When you realize that evil is this transpersonal sub-personality or a spirit that, under the right conditions, and if you let it, that could possess you, then that's where you are less susceptible, I believe, to becoming possessed by it. So, look, that's really what I wanted to unpack from the clip. Well, that's the part of the interview that I thought was really eye-opening to me, that I wanted to share with you and unpack in a bit more depth. So, just quickly, life is limitation. To be is to be limited, and to be limited is to suffer. And we presuppose an ideal, because all of us are moving, right? Whether we like it or not, we're moving, we're responding to our environment, we're living out a value hierarchy of some sort. Now, you might not be able to articulate your value hierarchy the same way I might not be able to articulate all of mine. And we can come back to that iceberg analogy, right? This is what we can articulate, what we know and can articulate. And this is everything below the surface that we know, that we live out, that we value, that we cannot articulate. So, what is life? To be is to be limited. To be limited is to suffer. And we are playing this game of overcoming the suffering and limitation. Now, can things get better? We all act as though they can. We act as though there is such a thing as sin, and that is, you might have an issue with the word sin if you identify as being atheist, but can we agree on, and again, can we find common ground on the atrocities that were committed at Auschwitz? If so, that's sin, right? To believe in human rights is to believe in sin. Then defining evil, much, much easier than defining the ideal. And if you can define evil and you can find common ground on it, then you presuppose a definition of the good or the ideal or the spirit, as JP would put it, the spirit, the proper, I think he said something like the spirit of proper unity. The spirit that takes us up. What exactly does up look like? Very difficult to say exactly. But I hope that, I just hope that this video has somewhat helped clarify this conception of, like, when I was younger, I just had an issue with these terms. Whenever anyone would say heaven or hell or God or Satan, I'd be thinking, you believe in these things. I can't see or touch them. They're not real. I've come full circle to now appreciate that if you view God as a matter of definition, as the opposite of evil, and you believe that there is such a thing as evil, that mode of being, lens of interpretation, pattern of behavior that amplifies and enjoys the process of amplifying suffering in the world, in conscious beings, then you, whether maybe you like it or not, and in the same way that I kind of realized whether I said it or not, I act like I believe in God. And I might say, I don't believe in God, but you act like you believe in, as an example, you believe in the concept. You believe in evil. You believe in sin. And therefore, you believe in God, even though you might not be able to say exactly what God is. And that's what Peterson meant when he said that God is ineffable. So, what do you believe in? Do you believe in God? I suppose that's the question that I'll leave you with to round out this video. Have a good day.